You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 47. This time, Karyne laughed so hard he coughed. When he finally caught his breath, he squinted up at the older man, the pockmarked scars resembling destination points on the maps in The Sins of the Stars. He'd thought all those points led to Daisy, but now he didn't know what to think about anything. If my parents had a reward on her head, do you think I'd march in here and announce my name? The man's glare didn't falter.
They may revere you in the north, but your image gets more distorted the farther south you go. They say your sister will be the queen to save Riston, second only to Queen Amaya, the first queen of Eleness, who united all of Vendaris under the sun.
The stranger waved his arms out in mock praise, making Karyne's gut clench. He couldn't argue with the man for thinking the northern people were overly obsessed with having a perfect monarch, but it wasn't Enla's fault they'd put her on a pedestal.
But you...
The man bent forward, tapping Karyne's chest with a gnarled finger.
They also speak of you. They say you can't take anything seriously, that you look pretty enough beside your sister, but you're not good for anything else.
The words shouldn't have stung, but they did. Karyne took the things that mattered seriously. Those close to him knew that. But most of what went on in Eleness was pomp and ceremony. If he didn't laugh at it all, he'd grow depressed over the waste. If I'm not good for anything else, why am I tied up like I'm a threat? The stranger straightened.
Do you know why your parents are after Eliana?
Karyne let his gaze flick over the old man's shoulder, taking in Daisy as she gnawed on her lip, her brow crinkled. The man next to her took a step closer, as if to shield her, but Karyne noticed she stepped away, rejecting his protection. For some reason, it made Karyne smile.
You find this amusing?
The older man barked. I try to find something to be amused about every day. You never know when it might be your last. I'd like to be happy whenever I join the sun. He rested his head back against the trunk. It didn't matter what he said. They wouldn't believe him. Besides, maybe his parents did have some sort of reward out for Daisy. It wasn't like he'd been home recently to check. But if that was the case, the man's question was a good one. Why? Shouts came from beyond the small crowd of strangers, causing everyone to turn and further block Karyne's view. We found 2 more of them coming from the southwest. The crowd parted for the petite older man who spoke, finally revealing Riverin and Aura marching Karyne's way, their wrists bound in front of them. Karyne grinned in relief, the humor of his reaction not lost on him. A few weeks ago, he hadn't been particularly fond of either of them, and now they were a welcome sight. Did you find their grandfather? He called. Riverin's face brightened as he sought out Karyne among the strangers, until he saw Karyne tied up.
Yes.
His surly response was all Karyne got before they were hushed. A much bigger man nudged Riverin forward, his voice soft.
The criminal claims to be his oldest friend.
Riverin avoided Karyne's eyes.
And the woman refused to answer any questions until she saw Eliana.
Daisy craned her neck around her personal guard, and to Karyne's surprise, her face turned a fascinating shade of pink. You! In a blink, Daisy rushed at Aura, her attack blocked by Riverin as he stepped between them. She beat a fist weakly on his chest and continued shouting at Aura despite the wall between them. "You stood by and did nothing. She died and you just watched." Karyne frowned, noting for the first time that Daisy favored her left shoulder. She cried out, then slumped to the ground. Despite her bonds, Aura stepped around Riverin, crouched, and placed her hands on Daisy's shoulder. The younger woman flinched, then gasped. Several of the strangers started forward, but Daisy rotated her shoulder, raising her eyes to meet Aura's. From this distance and angle, Karyne couldn't see her expression, but he imagined it mirrored the sensation he often got around Aura. Surprise, distrust, hope, curiosity, wonder, confusion. "I would have healed her if I could have," Aura whispered, but her voice still carried through the silence. "I wasn't truly there. For that moment, I was even more ethereal than the dark spirits your blood summoned." She shut her eyes, the pained expression making her look far older. "I did the only thing I could, and sang her to sleep. I sang her to the sun. The song of the stars." The awestruck words came from a man with unseemly long red hair, his face covered in freckles. His eyes took on an understanding that passed through the others listening in, and he dropped to his knees in a bow. Karyne held back a snort. Aura? A star? She'd hardly left his side, let alone taken to the skies. And if communing with a star was the same as talking in circles with that woman, he wasn't interested in regaining that benefit in the sun-gazers. Aura wiped her eyes, then stood, awkwardly pulling the freckled man to his feet. "I deserve no such honor." Her clipped words seemed to wake everyone up, but the damage was done. Reverent and curious gazes followed her every move, even the swipe to catch the stray tears on her cheek. "You have my honor and my gratitude anyway," the freckled man said. "If you sang gams to her eternal sleep, her end was far more peaceful than I imagined." The man's throat bobbed as he swallowed again and again, the skin around his eyes turning red. Aura refused to look the man in the eye. If anything, that made Karyne consider the possibility more. Having her secrets exposed might be the only thing powerful enough to subdue her.
"Why do you travel with the Prince of Eleness?"
The old man hobbled away from Karyne, his inquisition shifting to Aura. Aura straightened under his scrutiny. "When I saw Eliana use the Star Bridge, I knew it would take her to Bamboo Island. Karyne agreed to give me passage. We've been working together to find Eliana and the Star Bridge ever since." The man with the scars turned his glare back to Karyne.
"Is that true?"
He nodded, sitting up a little straighter. "When did my parents put out the reward for Eliana?"
"Half a moon ago."
The man frowned as if disappointed that Karyne couldn't possibly know about the warrant. For a moment, Karyne felt relief that his mother was well enough for his parents to issue an edict.
"They're falling further under Mavis's control,"
the man said. "Control?" Karyne's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Several others exchanged glances. The old man hobbled back.
"Don't you pay attention to your politics, boy?"
"I do when they matter. It's always been more of Endless thing." He knew it was the wrong answer the instant the stranger's face twisted into a deeper sneer.
"They always matter. It won't be long before your parents relent to Mavis, and then your sister won't have any throne to succeed. Or if she does, it will be in name only. Mavis will see to that."
He bent down and untied Karyne. Others in the group drew weapons, but Karyne merely rubbed his wrists. "What, you trust me now?" The old man let out a snort that reminded Karyne of Skunk's whinny.
"Hardly. But you weren't part of that decree. You're foolish and young, oblivious to the ways of the world and the things going on in your country right beneath your crooked nose. Stupidity isn't a crime. Yet.
His glare softened to pity, which was somehow worse.
Kendallin will still sift your soul's past, but you're as harmless as your critics say.
Humiliation flooded Karyne, trapping him amongst the strangers more than the rope had. The moment the old man turned his back on Karyne, the others slid their weapons back in place, shifting their attention to Daisy, who removed Aura's binds, then Riveren's. Aura and Daisy stepped to the side, clearly planning to have a private conversation, but the freckled man joined them. Maybe this had been part of Aura's plan all along. To get to Daisy before Karyne could. What did Aura want with her? And where was the Starbridge? The short woman with braids whom he'd accidentally saved planted herself in front of Karyne, arms crossed. "Let's get this over with." "Get what?" She grabbed his hand and closed her eyes. Karyne automatically threw up mental shields, blocking her invasion with his Starlock's energy the way his progeny mentors had taught him. This must be Kendallin. "If you don't cooperate, the shackles go back on," she murmured. "Right." He closed his eyes, pulling back on his Starlock's power, willing the shields to recede. He tried opening up his mind for her to excavate, but his self-defense training had almost been too thorough, and it took a few attempts. Once she made it in, he squirmed as he waited for her to finish her perusal. His mentors were the only ones who'd had this kind of access to Karyne's mind, and it felt backwards to give in so easily. Especially when she started laughing. "She's not as innocent as you think." She dropped his hand and shook her head in disbelief. "Your mind is like a child's, categorizing people as good and evil, right and wrong. It doesn't work that way." He glanced around at the others, but most had cleared out, leaving Daisy, Aura, and the freckled man to their privacy. Even Riveren had gone to let their horses join the others at grazing. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kendallin raised her eyebrows. "There's a purity around her in your mind, like she can do no wrong. You know she does blood magic, right?" Her words took the breath out of him. Blood magic? He thought back on Aura's comment about the dark spirits being drawn to Daisy's blood. She'd done blood magic. "Yeah, we've all been disappointed. Silmar made it sound like she'd change everything." She glanced at the man with thick scars. "If Mavis wants her, we should too, right? Only it seems Mavis just likes collecting her family members and keeping them close. I wouldn't be surprised if the two of them join up and rule the world together." She turned to go, but Karyne grabbed her arm. Something about her smile made him hesitate. There was a predatory hint, like when Lenda tried manipulating him to get what she wanted. Kendallin was goading him, but he didn't know why. "Their family? I thought you lived with the priestess for a year." She gave him an incredulous look. "Surely in that time you heard Emerys talk about her dear sister Mavis." He frowned, trying to remember if there'd been any talk of an aunt. He'd known Daisy's parents were hiding her, but he didn't know what or whom they were hiding her from. He hadn't even known who Mavis was back then, but that didn't mean she hadn't already been climbing her way into power. He'd been 8, and he'd cared even less about politics then than he did now. Kendallin narrowed her eyes and folded her arms across her chest. "You don't know who she is, do you? You don't know who any of them are." Her eyes softened, then lost focus, like when Enla saw a vision. "What are you talking about?" Kendallin's focus snapped back to the present. "She's a Windren. They're all Windrens." Karyne took a step back. His face stung like her words had slapped him. He sought out Daisy, but he couldn't reconcile the woman talking to Aura and patting the freckled man's back with the family line he'd been raised to hate. Enla had been so sure that none of them existed anymore, but she'd also been insistent that Mavis wasn't after more power. She needed to know Mavis was part of the line contesting their throne, that their line hadn't died out but had been hiding, biding their time until they could get themselves in a position of power. This was the proof he needed. It could change everything. But how would that change things for Daisy? And should it? A throne warden would take out every threat to the crown, and anyone who could produce more Windren heirs was considered a threat. His mind tried to wrap around the idea that the woman he'd been hunting to protect was now suddenly someone he was supposed to hunt as a threat. I thought recreants don't want a ruler, but you all want her on the throne instead of my family? Kendallin snorted. Eliana? No. She would be a terrible ruler. Silmar hasn't even told her that her family has claim to the throne. She's too weak to handle that kind of information. The Southern and Western recreants push for democracy because they've been under your family's thumb for too long. For those of us in the East, we're still open to a ruler, and Eliana's mother is our first choice. We'd like the other recreants to see this option as superior to your tyranny, but for now, we all simply agree that Mavis needs to be removed. We can figure out the rest later. She raised her eyebrows. If you want Silmar to keep you around, you should make that your focus as well. Then she walked off, leaving Karyne to digest everything she'd said. He closed his eyes, picturing Daisy's dimpled smile and curly locks. He wanted that simple, sweet toddler back.
Kendallin says you wish Eliana no harm.
Silmar's scratchy voice brought Karyne's eyes open. He stared at the older man, knowing he should agree but too confused to say the words and mean them. I came to protect her.
But now?
Karyne shook his head. Now, I don't know. She doesn't need my protection. I shouldn't even want to protect her if she's a... Silmar swore, glancing over his shoulder at Kendallin.
That girl needs to learn to keep her mouth shut. She's supposed to find your secrets, not spill all of ours.
Well, like you said, I'm young and stupid. Karyne clenched his fists. I don't have secrets. I wanted to protect her because it was my childhood promise. She may not need my protection, but I'm not going to hurt her. The words coming out of his mouth didn't sound right. He still wanted to protect her, but deep down, it was like he'd been betrayed. Like she'd fooled him into caring about her for this very moment, so she could throw it in his face that he'd fallen for it. Protecting her was the thing he'd held on to all these years. It was the one thing he'd needed to fix. And if he could fix this one thing, maybe it would get easier to fix the next thing. He'd been a fool. All his life, he'd fought to avoid the drama of court and the pain of politics. He'd used his travels as a means of escape, not because he cared too little, but because he cared too much about the people around him, about the things he couldn't change. Only now he realized it had made everyone think he didn't care at all. Maybe it didn't matter whether or not he could change something. Maybe it only mattered that he tried. He should have tried harder. Silmar hummed, breaking through Karyne's thoughts.
There are recreants who would kill you just for being an LNS.
Karyne nodded slowly, his heart racing. I'm hoping you're pointing that out because you're not one of them. They stared at each other for a long moment.
Kendallin also says you have it out for Mavis almost as much as we do.
I've been warning Enla about her for years. She's a threat my family refuses to consider. Like she's too far away to be a concern and too holy to be a fraud. After seeing what she's done here, he waved his hand in the direction of his Lara, his mind traveling through the hundreds of deaths he'd seen and relived. And after learning she partakes in blood magic, I'm as committed as you are to removing Mavis. She's a threat to loyalists as well, whether or not she's a Windren. At least this much was true. He could say it with confidence. He could fight alongside these people to take down Mavis, but after that, his stomach twisted like he might throw up. Hopefully he would have a better idea of what he was supposed to do then. Maybe even that was too much. Clearly Daisy didn't need him. Maybe it was time to just let her go. His stomach churned at the thought. Silmar slowly nodded.
And what about the star bridges? Kendallin says you want those too.
Garen shrugged. Originally, I wanted them to cross the barrier and find Daisy. Once she returned, I knew they'd still be valuable. I figured Enla might want them. He clenched his jaw. He didn't want this man to see him as a threat, but he wasn't about to share his desire to be an ambassador to potentially unite all the people groups of Riston. It was exactly the kind of thing Silmar would use to support his opinion of Garen as naive. Silmar coughed out some sort of laugh.
A treasure hunt?
Garen nodded, even though the description wasn't accurate. At this point, seeing how organized the recreants were made securing the star bridges less of a treasure hunt and more of a necessity. If they could all go after Mavis, what would stop them from coming after the LNSs next? As Throne Warden, having an escape option might be his only way to protect his family. Maybe I don't need the star bridges anymore, Garen said. But after hunting them for the better part of a year, there's still something I want. Aura wants them too, and I'm willing to work with her to find them.
Oh, I already know she wants them. She'll probably use you to get them.
Silmar's gaze shot to Aura.
The question is, why?
Chapter 48. Eliana tried paying attention to Aura and Cyrus, as Aura recounted Della's last moments. She even rubbed Cyrus's back as he relived his grief. But her attention kept straying to the prince, as Kendallin invaded his mind, the same way she'd invaded Eliana's and the dragon's. There was something vulnerable about the way he closed his eyes after Kendallin left. Something disarming about the way he let Silmar confront him. Curiosity warred with irritation as she remembered the way he'd spoken of their childhood, the way he'd spoken of her, and then the way he'd so easily condemned the dragon to death. That last one fit more with the image she'd been given of the LNSs. The star bridge isn't here, is it? Aura's voice broke into Eliana's thoughts, and she turned her attention back to the other woman. The question had been directed at Cyrus, but his tears had started up again. No, Eliana said. Arvid took it to Mavis. Aura's eyes slid shut, but she nodded her understanding. She wishes to use them for power, to make the world smaller. Eliana frowned. I thought it was to keep it away from me, so I couldn't go back. Perhaps. Aura shrugged. Beyond the clearing, Silmar gathered Lukai and Holm, gesturing back toward Islara, back toward Durican. Thank you, Cyrus said, for everything. He barely got the words out before he rushed away from the camp. Maybe it was worse that Aura had come. Maybe she'd torn his grief wide open again. Are you really a star? Eliana had imagined them brighter, more powerful, then immediately worried her thoughts were blasphemous. Aura's gaze turned sharp. I can't take to the skies. I wouldn't be a very good star if I was one. It felt like a riddle, a non-answer. But before Eliana could question her further, Kendallin joined them. You're last, Kendallin said, holding out a shaking hand for Aura. The younger woman's eyes darted around the camp, and Eliana supposed it might be nerve-wracking to try sifting through the soul of someone who might be a star. Garen stood nearby, probably within hearing distance. The corner of his lips lifted, more like he found Eliana amusing than he was actually smiling at her. The other two are harmless, Kendallin went on when Aura didn't take her hand right away. Turns out the criminal isn't even very dangerous. He stole bread to feed his family. Not exactly a crime worthy of the traitor's brand. Eliana still watched Karyne, and his face slackened with surprise at Kendallin's words. His gaze sought out the man they'd called Riverin, and his brow furrowed. Good. Whatever disagreement those two were having could end his childish staring contest with Eliana. When Aura finally took Kendallin's hand, Kendallin frowned. You'll have to let your guard down. Otherwise, Silmar will want you bound for the rest of our travels. I'd like to see him try. Aura's face softened into something more like amusement than irritation. The rest of our travels? Eliana asked. He means to take them with us? She glanced back at Karyne, whose curious gaze was irritatingly back on her. The prince wants you, or maybe the Starbridges, so he also wants to go after Mavis. Kendallin's voice rose, making Eliana's face heat. And the friend will go wherever the prince goes, some sort of childhood promise or vow or something. I'm guessing Silmar is keeping them close to watch them, not necessarily because he trusts them. Does it ever feel wrong knowing so much about people when they haven't willingly given you the information? Eliana asked, her words sharp with her frustration. The other woman didn't have to spill everyone's secrets just because she knew them. Kendallin's eyes flew open. All efforts to sift Aura's soul gone. You'd be surprised at how willing people are to be seen. It takes little effort on my part. When you sift through someone's soul and their darkest and brightest parts and still love them, there's nothing to match the sensation of being seen and loved. It was more than Kendallin had ever shared with Eliana, but it felt like an insult. Or at the very least, a reprimand. Kendallin had seen Eliana's darkest parts and held no love for her. True words, even when spoken so harshly, Aura murmured, surprising both women out of their anger. Kendallin closed her eyes and squeezed Aura's hand once more. Eliana stepped away, not wanting to witness another display of Kendallin's magic. Karyne straightened, his eyes still on Eliana, but she wasn't ready for whatever he might say. Her throat felt raw after facing Durican, after defending a beast and reviving a stranger, only to watch the stranger turn on the beast. She didn't trust herself to accurately evaluate anything Karyne might have to say. Besides, Silmar, Lukai, and Holm were leading Jasperus and Veldin toward Islara. She picked up her pace to follow, but Silmar saw her coming and shook his head. It needs to be done. Her insides grew cold. No. He's branded. There has to be a way to undo the brand. Jasperus told me they could be cut out. Silmar hesitated, then let the others get ahead of them. He's a dragon. We don't know if it works the same way. We don't even know if he has magic for her to control. The memories she'd seen from the dragon flooded her mind. He definitely had magic, but she wasn't sure if knowing that would make Silmar more or less likely to kill him.
Besides,
Silmar added,
it's nearly impossible to get close enough. He won't let us cut it out.
You left him unconscious. It should be easy. If cutting out the brand could remove his connection to her, don't we have to at least try? She let her gaze bore into Silmar's, willing him to consider it. He hesitated, making her hope rise.
Do you want to risk the lives of everyone you love on a possibility?
She looked away, hating his logic, hating how the memories she'd received from the dragon defied his logic. Karyne stood only a few feet away, far too interested in their conversation. She frowned at him, but he stared back, undeterred. Silmar turned to catch up with the others, and Aeliana watched him go. She couldn't save Durrican, but she could stay with him. It was better than facing Karyne. Maybe, like Aura, she could sing the dragon to the stars or the sun, or whatever awaited them all beyond this life. She rushed to join Silmar, stumbling over her thoughts. She hadn't cared to evaluate what the servants of the stars taught when she was growing up, but now she felt a burning desire to know the truth. Were the stars worthy to be worshipped? Or were they created by something greater, like the sun? She supposed Cyrus's faith hadn't wavered like hers. The sky that had been dark with clouds now grew black with the setting sun. The stars and moon remained hidden, the only light coming from the torches carried by the men. They entered the gate, weapons drawn. From a distance, the dragon looked almost like a large dog, curled up and passed out from an afternoon of play. His chest rose and fell as hot breath escaped his nostrils, his black tongue lolling out the side of his open mouth. Without hesitating, Silmar walked up to the beast's side and laid his staff and hands on the dragon's scales. Aeliana closed her eyes. Would it be peaceful? Or would the air be rent with Durrican's shrieks of agony? She sensed a warm presence at her side and opened her eyes to find Karyne observing Silmar's work. Karyne's focus remained on Durrican, but his body angled toward Aeliana, his hand on the hilt of his dagger, as if ready to defend her should the need arise. Aeliana almost laughed. That dagger couldn't protect anyone from Durrican. Several long moments passed, and Lukai, Holm, Jasperus, and Veldon huddled together, whispering. She slipped around them, making her way toward Silmar. The old man sucked in several gasps of breath, turning his frustrated glare on Aeliana. She expected him to send her away, to make some comment about her reckless behavior, putting herself in harm's way. He bent over, hands on his knees.
I can't.
You can't kill him? Hope bloomed in her chest. He shook his head, wiping the sweat from his upper lip while squinting up at her. If his destructive somatic skills couldn't kill Durrican, it wasn't from lack of effort.
It's possible I could after resting, maybe recharging in the sun.
He straightened, then leaned on Durrican for support.
I've drained too much energy today. My Starlock resists. but Durakin's likely to wake before I'm ready.
So we debrand him instead? Remove his collar? Every one of her limbs felt lighter. Silmar sighed.
For now. To weaken him. And we tie him up for the remainder of the night. Tomorrow, we try again. He's too powerful a weapon to give back to Mavis.
Eliana frowned, but she couldn't argue. The men went to work tying Durakin's paws and snout. His wings remained shredded, but Eliana noticed several areas had begun to heal. Perhaps it was another form of the dragon's magic. Once he was secured, Jasperus and Holm stepped forward and began slicing at the mark on Durakin's paw. Its shape was uncomfortably similar to Eliana's bond mark, but far larger and raised like a black blister, taking up a quarter of the dragon's paw. Despite being unconscious, the beast groaned, pulling his paws from their grip. As the men's agitation grew, so did Durakin's.
Stop,
Eliana hissed. Jasperus and Holm froze, just as Durakin's eyelids rolled open, revealing large purple irises with a cat-like gleam. Durakin reared back, attempting to open his mouth with a roar. It provided the men enough time to scramble away, but Durakin quickly snapped apart the ropes holding his snout, the frayed, blackened edges making all their ties laughable. He didn't bother with the ropes around his paws. His eyes followed Eliana as she stepped forward, shielding the men. I have to be the one to do it. He won't hurt me. I don't think he can. She glanced back to find Karyne once again on her heel. Before he could argue, she snatched the dagger from his hand, then took 3 tentative steps forward, ignoring Lukai's and maybe Karyne's hushed protests. Durakin shifted, eyeing the dagger warily. You want to be free of Mavis? Eliana asked. The dragon went rigid, his gaze even more intense. Should I remove the brand or the collar first? He cocked his head. Had he understood? His paw remained face up, bleeding from where Holm and Jasperus had started working. Eliana shivered at the sight. Would his blood tempt her as much as a half-light's? Would it tempt her more? Still, she pressed on until she was close enough to touch the dragon. Brand? She gestured at his paw. Or collar. She moved her other hand within biting distance of his snout. Whether he understood or not, he shifted on his side, lying back down, eyes still studying her. He settled his bound paws back in front of her, then closed his eyes. The vulnerability of the action made her throat clog with sympathy. How could Silmar think Durakin wanted anything other than his freedom? She held the dagger over the dragon's paw, inhaling the stench of his blood. The headiness of it made her grasp his paw to steady herself, and she sensed him tense beneath her. As she began gently carving the brand out from the creature's paw, he squirmed and flinched, letting out the occasional growl or moan as he tried to pull away. A few times he snapped his jaws as if he might stop her, but Eliana suspected that whatever compelled him to keep her alive was stronger than whatever compelled him to fight her efforts to remove his brand. As she worked, the clouds rolled back, revealing the waning moon, which shed light on Duraken's paw as Eliana worked. The stars did their dance, as if celebrating this turn of events. Eventually, the branded skin lay flayed at her feet. She placed her hands over the wound, squirming at the sticky sensation of raw flesh and blood. Duraken inhaled sharply, and Eliana braced herself for the expected fire from his breath. When it didn't come, she refocused, attempting to draw energy from her starlock. The starlock remained cold against her chest, having had no opportunity to recharge since she'd used it. For the first time, the lack of magic frightened her. She'd grown used to it. "My magic," she said. "It's gone. I'm sorry." Duraken cocked his head, then tensed along with Eliana as Karyne placed a hand on her shoulder. Warmth rushed through her, and for the first time, she experienced the sensation of being on the receiving end of someone's energy. It felt oddly comforting, and a small part of her wished it had come from Lukai, or really anyone, instead of Karyne. In turn, she pushed the energy out through her hands, weaving and stitching Duraken's skin together, growing it until the stickiness underneath her hands was more scab and scars than open wound. His blood called to her, but not in the same way a half-light's did. She suspected she could use it, but it was easier to resist. Karyne stepped back when the job was done, but Eliana stayed, relishing the vulnerability of her hand on Duraken's paw. Healing him, her supposed enemy, was like a balm for her soul. She'd come across the barrier, wanting to be rid of magic. Because of that single-mindedness, she'd held back, just like Silmar said. Now it seemed impossible to separate the magic from who she was, from who she was becoming. And for the first time, she didn't want to separate the two. She didn't want to hold back. Even saving her mother and returning Cyrus to Lorvandus felt small in this moment. She could do so much more with her magic if she let herself try. Healing Duraken was more than putting together skin and flesh. The wounds went far deeper, and so did her magic. She had the potential to heal wounds, bond rifts, or reconcile broken relationships. And she was doing it without using blood. "How much more could I do if I lean into my magic?" she whispered, grateful only Duraken could hear. She shivered at both the thrill and fear of the answer, and her starlock warmed against her skin in its own encouraging way. When Duraken's breath finally came, it was warm and soft, tickling her neck as it blew her hair out around her. "That's enough, Eliana," Silmar hissed. "We can finish tomorrow." She stepped forward, ignoring Silmar. She placed a hand on Duraken's snout, and the same memories that she had seen earlier flooded her mind.
Silmar's idea of finishing would be to take the dragon's life, remove him as a threat. But Durikin was no more a willing murderer than she had been. "We can fix this," she murmured. When she brushed Durikin's collar with her hand, the cold metal shocked her, but she kept running her hands along what felt like ice until she reached the clasp. It took several tries to find the right place to press and release it, but when she did, Durikin let out a small moan of relief. She'd been as trapped as Durikin, but now, instead of being held back by fear of being made a brand and fear of her own power, she felt free from everyone's expectations. She was free to figure out who she could be with her magic. The metal fell away from his neck, leaving behind a strip of raw skin where the scales had been rubbed off, exposing a leathery expanse of flesh. Her mind flashed to her awakening, her visions. She'd seen this moment. This had always been a part of her future. Somehow, sensing that truth made her giddy with relief. She had always been meant to free Durikin. "Daisy!" She flinched, then turned to see Karyne drawing his sword. The other men had been too scared to startle the dragon, too afraid of putting her at risk. But now they followed suit. "Move!" Karyne shouted as he ran toward her. "It's his only vulnerability." She turned back, taking in the sight of Durikin's neck, the exposed skin creating a clear target to behead the creature. "Fly," she whispered, momentarily forgetting the beast no longer had functioning wings. "Run! Get out of here!" Even as her voice rose to a shout, Durikin summed up the situation and pulled at the ropes tying him. He breathed out tiny sparks, disintegrating the ties, then tucked in his wings, rolling back out of Karyne's reach. His hiss came out like steam, and he opened his mouth, but Eliana stood in front of Karyne. "Go, please, just go," she begged. The purple irises flicked their focus between the two of them. At first, Eliana thought he was debating whether to stay or go, but then she saw his wings slowly healing, like a tapestry's gaps being repaired and tightened. "What are you doing?" Karyne growled. "Saving your life," Eliana said. Durikin spread his wings, then ran at both of them. For a moment, Eliana thought she'd been wrong. Karyne pulled her down to the ground, wrapping himself over and around her until she was tucked beneath him, as if his body might be made of armor. But his self-sacrifice was unnecessary. Over his shoulder, she glimpsed Durikin wink before taking to the darkened sky. I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Thanks so much for listening.